In 1944, with the Second World War still being fought on two continents, the United States convened a meeting at a hotel in New Hampshire. 44 nations sent delegates. The agenda was not military strategy. It was not troop movements or supply lines. It was prices. Specifically, how to stop them from destroying the post-war world before the post-war world had even started. Because the people in that room understood something that most history books skip over entirely. Wars don't just kill people and destroy buildings. They do something to money. Something predictable. Something almost mechanical. They make everything cost more. And the reasons why tell you something uncomfortable about how economies actually function when the stakes are highest. Start with the most basic economic relationship there is. Supply and demand. When demand for something rises faster than supply can keep up, prices go up. This is not controversial. This is Tuesday. Now imagine an entire economy redirected toward a single purpose overnight. In 1943, approximately 40% of US GDP was consumed by military spending. Factories that made cars were retooled to make tanks. Steel that would have gone into refrigerators went into battleships. Rubber, aluminum, copper, oil, all of it rerouted toward the war effort at a scale that civilian markets had never experienced. The supply of consumer goods collapsed. The number of workers earning wages did not. In fact, employment boomed, because armies need soldiers and factories need workers. So you had more people with more money chasing dramatically fewer goods. The formula for inflation doesn't get more textbook than that. But here's where it gets more interesting than the textbook. Governments at war don't just redirect existing money. They create new money. Wars are expensive in ways that peacetime budgets simply cannot absorb through normal taxation. The US spent roughly $4 trillion in today's terms fighting the Second World War. Britain spent itself into a debtor nation. The Soviet Union mobilized resources on a scale that strained the concept of accounting. None of this was funded purely through tax receipts. It was funded through borrowing, through money creation, through financial mechanisms that expanded the money supply at precisely the moment when the supply of things to buy was shrinking. More money. Fewer goods. The inflationary pressure doesn't just appear. It's structurally guaranteed. This pattern repeats with remarkable consistency across history. The American Civil War produced inflation of over 80% in the North. The First World War triggered price surges across every participating economy. The Vietnam War contributed directly to the inflation crisis of the 1970s, a crisis that took a decade and a painful recession to resolve. And the post-pandemic inflation of 2021 to 2023, while not a traditional war, followed an almost identical template: a massive government spending shock, a supply chain collapse, and a flood of new money entering an economy that couldn't produce enough to absorb it. The mechanism is not new. It is not subtle. And yet every generation seems surprised when it arrives. Now here is the part that almost nobody talks about. What happens when the war ends? The intuitive answer is that things get better. Factories go back to making consumer goods. Workers come home. Supply recovers. Prices stabilize or fall. And sometimes, this is exactly what happens. But sometimes, what follows a war is not recovery. It's deflation. And deflation, which sounds like the opposite of a problem, can be equally destructive, just slower and quieter about it. After the First World War, the major European economies faced a brutal reckoning. The wartime spending had been financed by debt and money creation. Now the war was over. Governments, under pressure from creditors and orthodox economic thinking, began trying to restore pre-war price levels. They raised interest rates. They cut spending. They contracted the money supply. Prices fell. And as prices fell, something worse happened. Debtors, farmers, businesses, ordinary people who had borrowed at wartime prices, found themselves repaying loans in currency that was now worth more. Their debts grew in real terms. Defaults rose. Banks contracted lending. The economy contracted further. Which pushed prices down further. Which made debt more expensive further. Germany's experience was the most extreme. First hyperinflation as the government printed money to pay war reparations. Then, after stabilization, a deflationary depression that helped create the political conditions for what came next. The economics of the interwar period didn't cause the Second World War. But they created a population angry, humiliated, and desperate enough to listen to people who had simple explanations for complicated problems. Deflation is not the benign mirror image of inflation. In a debt-based economy, falling prices are often falling incomes, falling employment, and rising desperation. There is a quieter version of this dynamic playing out right now, in the background of every major economy on Earth. The post-pandemic spending surge that was, in effect, a war economy response to a supply shock has left governments carrying debt loads that will shape fiscal policy for a generation. The inflationary burst it produced has been partially controlled through aggressive interest rate increases. But those rate increases have their own consequences: slower growth, tighter credit, pressure on governments already stretched by higher borrowing costs. The war is over. The bill is arriving. And the question of whether the transition resolves through gradual stabilization or through a deflationary contraction that nobody planned for is genuinely, uncomfortably open. Wars are inflationary because they flood money into economies while simultaneously destroying their ability to produce. Peace is sometimes deflationary because cleaning up the financial wreckage of a war requires the opposite: contracting money, repaying debt, restoring balances, at exactly the moment when populations are exhausted and least able to absorb the cost. The fighting stops. The economic consequences don't. And the inflation you live through during a crisis, and the deflation you might live through after it, are not random events. They are the predictable outputs of decisions made under pressure, by people who are trying to survive the moment without fully accounting for what comes next. Which raises a question worth holding on to. If the inflationary consequences of emergency spending are this well documented, this historically consistent, this foreseeable, why do the people making those decisions always seem surprised by the bill?